Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get this meeting started. The time is now 3:05. Let's see here. And I would like to open up the floor for opening remarks from the commissioners. Any comments? No? All right. With that said, we'll move on to the next agenda item. We're going to adopt the minutes from March 23rd, 2022. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All right, have a second. Thank you for that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Abstain, same sign. All right, motion passes. All right. Next on the order, old business. Discussion of initiative process reform proposals with follow-up questions from the commissioners. Does anyone have any questions or concerns or any input as it relates to the presentations, the material that we went over at last meeting? Any commissioners have any questions, suggestions, input?
Sure. Well, I'll say I thought it was all very clear. I didn't have any questions, but I was curious to know if there were any comments submitted to the, sorry, thanks. I was curious to know if there was any feedback from, public feedback on what was discussed at our last commission meeting, anything in the inbox or just other sort of feedback from the community relative to what we discussed at the last commission meeting.
Of course, Commissioner. Not as of yet. We did not get anything in the comment box. However, I would figure that when we do the public hearing in May, once we get that scheduled, we probably expect to hear some more on that, and probably leading up to it, we will be putting it out on social media and a few different things to try to drive input to that as well. So, and as to the comment box, because once we get into some of the bigger issues, we definitely want to make sure that that folks are aware and engaged on that.
Great. Just a quick follow-up, Chair. Yes. So just to refresh my memory, so we will, before we take any action on any recommendations relative to, what we heard from the last Charter Review Commission, we will have those public hearings and have the opportunity to hear from the public more specifically on those changes in particular. Is that correct?
I can't hear.
Yes, that's the idea, especially with something like the initiative proposals, which is probably one of the largest topics that we would deal with here, and something we want to take definitely want to take some time on. It wouldn't be a few things, a few issues that we have. We would likely have a proposal, have kind of a question and answer discussion, and then it could be followed by a vote to adopt or reject in the following meeting. This would not be one of those. I would anticipate more discussion over a few more commission meetings.
Thank you.
And something to add to that, if I may, we are also going to be working with a couple of our departments to make sure that we get information out about the commission and what the work that we're doing here, just to kind of educate them prior to November. So that'll also probably bring up some additional questions, comments in regards to from the community.
Good.
So we're
Great.
working on that.
Thanks. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments? I'd like to add that I'd like to thank the presenters that presented last session. I thought that it was a very fruitful conversation. I have had some conversations offline with some stakeholders. This was a very important topic of discussion, particularly for the business community. And so there are some folks that I'm still consulting as it relates to the recommendations that have been put on the table. I think that the recommendations that have been made thus far are very solid, but would like to continue to have discussions as it relates to this particular matter. So at this point in time, I would like to, I believe, table this particular topic unless there's other comments or suggestions that can be made towards this particular topic.
I'm sorry, Chair, you want to table,
So we're not going to pass any of the recommendations that were made, but we will come back to the meeting our next meeting and discuss or have further discussions as it relates to this particular matter.
because I don't want us to beat this to death.
Okay.
I think we just need to make a decision. I just don't want to keep talking about it week after week after week. I'd like for us to make a decision at some point and remove it from the table. Thank you.
Sir, thank you. Thank you so much, Commissioner. I will say that particularly for me, there are some folks that I've confined in that I would like to receive some additional feedback, particularly for this topic. However, I do share your sentiment that I do not want this to be something that's elongated out. So I think with the folks that I'm consulting and kind of reading further into this matter, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I don't think this will be a matter for me personally that I will want to have lingered out for weeks on end.
Okay, so the stakeholders that you've been having conversation with, would those individuals be invited to the public hearing that we're going to have, or is this going to be a separate conversation? Because I would like for everyone to have the opportunity to comment on this with the entire commission as opposed to just one. So that's my point on that. I don't want this to be a sidebar conversation with the community. I think it needs to be a big conversation and not little sidebar conversations.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And John, you had mentioned that there will be opportunities for the public to speak on this matter. Is that correct?
Yes, at the first public hearing that we'll be having in May, as well as the ability to put in public comments via the website now, or contacting council. So, yeah.
Certainly. Any other comments? No? Thank you. We're moving right along to new business. The acting mayor provision proposal. We have Chief of Staff Ken Paul presenting, is that correct?
That's correct.
Instead of Christina. So the floor is yours, Mr. Paul.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Good afternoon to members of the commission. Thank you for your service. A reminder of those viewing at home, this is all volunteer work, and your community is grateful, your mayor is grateful for your service, and really encouraged by the progress that's been made by the commission thus far, and looking forward to the outcomes. Today, presenting on a relatively straightforward topic. It's not necessarily the most pressing concern, but one that when you've got the charter open, you should take advantage of the opportunity to discuss any potential changes. And the sound's acting up a little bit. I will say, for those viewing at home, and if you didn't catch my name the first time around, my name is Ken Paul. I'm the Chief of Staff for Mayor Andrew Ginther, and happy to be with you today to talk about the appointment of acting mayor. The charter states that the mayor may, upon his or her absence, appoint an acting mayor, but it should be pointed out, it doesn't require, it is a may, not a shall. And it's probably wise. And in looking at the past couple of years and everything we've endured during the pandemic, with additional technologies being brought to bear, even suspension of some of the rules around public meetings, the need to appoint an acting mayor has lessened in some ways. However, there's still some times when the mayor needs to appoint an acting mayor. Most often is when the mayor is out of town, and we need to execute legislation, implement it, enact it, and that is upon the mayor's signature. And so in appointing an acting mayor, those powers are bestowed upon whoever is in that position. Right now, the charter limits who can be appointed acting mayor to the public service director, public safety director, or president of council. And part of the proposal and conversation we want to have today, and first we'll identify what the problem is or what the concern is. One, the charter was written at a time when public service and public safety were essentially the departments and effectively accounted for the bulk of the city's work and responsibilities. It was much smaller at that time. We now have 14 departments, all doing very important work, and all of whom are led by competent professionals who certainly possess the judgment and acumen to serve as acting mayor if called upon. And so, frankly, from a pragmatic standpoint, allowing for others to be called upon to serve in that capacity would provide greater flexibility and assure that we can continue to operate government in an efficient manner. The second part of that is that by allowing, under the charter currently, the council president to be named acting mayor, we actually create a potential for a conflict in that the charter also does not dictate that should the council president be named acting mayor, that he or she leave the powers of a council member behind. They retain those powers. So you could have a situation where on a Monday evening, the council president presides over a meeting of council, signs the legislation as the head of the legislative body of government, and then is appointed acting mayor, and then signs it as the chief executive the next day, which doesn't make much sense. And while it is unlikely that that would happen or that power would be abused, at the end of the day, you probably shouldn't have your charter, the constitution of our city, allowing for that potential. And so we have an opportunity now to sort of clear that up, to either just simply remove the council president as an option, or to the extent the commission would like to retain that as an option, just specify that should the council president be named acting mayor, that they would leave behind the powers of council. And that is where I would look to my friends in the city attorney's office to help craft specific language. So I guess I should have been following along my PowerPoint presentation, but the language that I referred to that names the city, the service director, the safety director, council president, that's the language, especially if relevant if those are looking for that language at home. I already stated the problem and what we're trying to solve. And for the purposes of this commission, the considerations are, do you want to expand the number of people who may be able to serve as acting mayor? If so, how do you want to make that determination? Would you prefer to make it more expansive? Would you prefer to be explicit in who might, or provide greater flexibility and define that more broadly? And then the second question is whether or not to retain the option to appoint the city council president, acting mayor, and if so, whether we limit the powers as a council member when serving in that capacity. I think that's it. Hopefully I explained it clearly enough. It's not that deep, but from a practical standpoint, it's something we should probably address, and would welcome any questions from the commission.
Thank you for the presentation. Any questions?
Well, I always have questions today, I think. I'm uncomfortable, as Chief of Staff Paul said, about the, I'm not talking loud enough. I'm not. I am now, am I?
That's better. Yes.
Okay, I got a big booming voice anyway. I'm in agreement with Chief of Staff Paul that the council president should not be appointed as the acting mayor because of the legislation that council signs based on what they receive from the administration. So I would not like to see that. So that's number one.
As I read through this the word emergency was there, and it would seem to me that that would imply you needed to react in a very short period of time, and having a predetermined hierarchy, much like I'm assuming the federal government does, that would seem to be the way to go, as opposed to having to appoint someone when it was necessary. And is there a way that we would wait the head of a particular agency? I mean, I think explained very well why those two are there now, but is there a hierarchy within city government?
Well, it's a good question. As presently stated, that's afforded the public safety director and public service director. I am actually referring back to the language because I think I missed any reference to emergency, because from a pragmatic and practical standpoint, acting mayors are named fairly frequently and most often not in a time of emergency. In fact, sort of contrary to that, there may be a rationale where in a state of emergency, the mayor may actually not want to appoint the safety director or service director as acting mayor if for some reason he or she wasn't able to execute their duties as mayor, simply because the safety director may in fact have other responsibilities that they're seeing to. Certainly in case of monitoring public safety. Just looking at the events of this past couple of years, and that may not have been the best decision to appoint the public safety director in that instance. So having the flexibility would be preferable. That said, a finance director certainly is someone that I think you would want to consider. Certainly the person who on a daily basis is overseeing the city's finances and working very closely with the auditor's office to maintain the financial stability of the city. I would contend that there is an option of the commission, depending on how deep you would want to get into the recommendations of expanding it even beyond the role of a director. Currently, and this is not to sound self-serving, but it's just the fact of the matter, the chief of staff and one deputy chief of staff of the city have signature authority on behalf of the mayor to enter into legally binding contracts. And that does not extend to legislation, however, but there is the potential there that you could extend similar powers to a chief of staff or other person within the mayor's office, not even a director. Certainly the commission's well within their purview to recommend specific members of the mayor's cabinet. You could limit the number of directors within that cabinet. You could expand it beyond. You could certainly set that in advance and establish that hierarchy while still allowing flexibility. I don't think there'll be any opposition on our part. Simply expanding the options would probably be a benefit to the office of the mayor looking forward. Hopefully I answered your question, Commissioner.
Chair, I was going to suggest, so thank you, Chief of Staff Kim Paul, for mentioning the Chief of Staff, because I was going to mention that as well, that perhaps the Chief of Staff be included in this, if the mayor is ill or is on vacation, whatever. But I'm thinking the Chief of Staff would, in my opinion, be the closest one, because of the Chief of Staff's relationship with all the departments within the city, all 14. Did you say there were 14? I wrote that down, all 14.
Yeah.
So that's my comment on that, and thank you so much.
Chair, if I could, and just to follow up on that and to clarify one point, and this might give some solace and predictability and in some ways some oversight of who could serve in that capacity, in that the departments are somewhat fungible in the sense that one mayor to another may establish more departments, or frankly may combine departments or eliminate departments. And there are certain departments within the city's government structure that have been maintained over the course of time, but certainly some have come and gone. Ultimately, those are ordained by council. It requires council action to establish a department, and by extension, a director of that department. And so there is the option too to more generally refer to the mayor may appoint a member of her or his cabinet to serve as acting mayor. And frankly, within the administrative code or through ordinance of council, determine what the cabinet is, in which case council would be assured who we're talking about and who they would want to see to be able to serve in that capacity. And that could include a chief of staff. It could include all directors, or it could be limited to directors who council believes are best positioned to serve in that capacity. Just food for thought.
Chair, quick question. First of all, I agree with my fellow commissioner in the sense that, in the sense that I think it does make sense to not cross the administrative and legislative branches here in this. It is interesting looking at some of these other cities that do that. So I agree with that. I think that makes sense. I had two questions. First is, the law director is an elected office holder, correct? As is the auditor?
Correct.
And can you remind me which other individually elected officers there are, if any, within city government?
Just in city government, it's
Yeah.
the mayor, city auditor, city attorney, and then at present, 7 members of council,
7 members of council.
soon to be 9
Okay.
next year.
Got it. Okay. Thanks. And does the mayor's office have an attorney, legal representation outside the city attorney's office?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That answers my question. The second question I had for you was just looking at these examples of these other cities, all great cities, by the way. Do you have any sense for how that determination is made when the mayor may be incapacitated and the vice mayor role may need to be activated? It doesn't really speak to it here in these examples.
I may phone a friend and City Attorney Laura Baker, who's sitting to my right, on part of this response, but I think I can get a portion of it correct. And one point to make, there are some examples that commissioners been presented with as part of your packet today. It is probably worthwhile to go back and examine those examples a little closer and perhaps provide some additional examples. Commissioner McCarthy, you can appreciate there's a lot of differences in governance structure from one city to the next, and differences in size and scale and how cities are organized also. And some of the examples that you've been given, I believe, are cities where there is not a strong mayor government. And so it's important to note the difference between the two, especially since in some cities, the president of council actually serves as mayor. Because they're not a strong mayor and frankly rely on a city manager to make some of the decisions required to keep the city functioning. In Columbus, the mayor plays that role of city manager and in fact executes contracts on a daily basis and is the implementing body or the executive versus a city manager form of government. The second part where it becomes a little fuzzy and gray is that this part of the charter is really focused on an instance where the mayor can predict at a moment in time when she or he isn't able to be present to perform some of the duties of mayor. Now, the May language means that you could be in Dublin or Pataskala or Cincinnati and still be in direct contact with your cabinet, with your chief of staff, and effectively be giving direction. It's a question of whether or not there are certain duties where you need to be physically present to be able to execute the duties of mayor. One that I've provided as an example is signing legislation. But in this case, in this section of the charter, this presumes that the mayor has the ability in advance to predict that and can name someone when they're out of town, for instance. The incapacity is an entirely different part of our charter, and I believe is dealt with in separate language. And this is where I'm starting to look at my phone a friend here to my right. And there's actually a form in which that spells out and where each elected office holder determines who is essentially making decisions in their stead should they become incapacitated. City Attorney Baker, did I speak to that correctly?
Chief of Staff Paul, you did an excellent job. Yes, everything he just said was accurate from a legal perspective as well, particularly when you take a look at the information that was provided. Cincinnati is a great example. So there you are talking about a mayor and how the mayor shall be elected and the vice mayor, what have you. But Cincinnati is, as Chief of Staff Paul just stated, a city manager type form of government. And so their structure is different. Within the city of Columbus, our charter deals with permanent and temporary inability of mayors at section 64-1 and 64-2. So those are when you have like for instance, if the mayor were to undergo surgery or anesthesia for a period of time, or if there were some medical issue such that that person couldn't perform their job functions, those sections would then kick in depending on how permanent that situation might be, versus the acting mayor part that we're talking about now is much more of the practical application of some requirements. Technically speaking, if the mayor's outside of the city, there has to be an acting mayor. And that's certainly not going to be limited to periods of time where there might be a medical issue or if someone is out of the country. That's going to be much more of a day-to-day. Yeah, they went to Dublin to have a meeting. How are we going to deal with signing legislation that day?
I would add too, just thanks to Chief Paul and Laura for clarifying one of the points I was going to make, talking about the one document that yes, you are dealing with different forms of government here, and the ones that tend to have a succession down to president of council or commission are the ones that tend more to the commission manager or council manager form of government, where they are technically all part of the legislature. So that's an easier transition than it would be.
So maybe I missed this, but are there specific positions, whether it's the auditor, whether it's the city attorney, are there any recommendations, specific recommendations as to who also could be charged with taking on the duties of the mayor? Do we have any?
Good question. Thanks for the opportunity to clarify. I think it would likely be advisable, and the city attorney may want to weigh in. I don't think it would be advisable to have another elected official serve in that capacity, just because there is a separation of powers, intentional in the city's charter. Now that is different from permanent incapacity, and that's sort of a line of succession in the event of the mayor's ultimate demise. That's a different set of circumstances. But in this instance, we're talking about on a temporary, predictable, practical standpoint. I don't think it would be wise to have another elected, especially, there may be the opportunity to retain that authority or option for the council president if the council president forgoed their responsibilities as a council member while being appointed mayor. That still poses some potential challenges based on the nature of the relationship between the council president and the remainder of the legislative branch, but might be able to be mitigated. But unfortunately, I think that would be more difficult for the role of city attorney or city auditor, and actually even more complicated than perhaps a member of council. So I think we would want to avoid looking at other electeds. Where other options and recommendations are concerned, I think the idea is, and our preference from the administration's point of view, is to simply expand those options. If it went from 2 to 4, that is 2 more options than we have today, which is not a bad thing. Ideally, I think we could present language for your consideration, and I think that's probably the most prudent next step would be to come back with actual language to present to you to get feedback on. But I think one option is to simply leave it fairly open to a member of the mayor's cabinet and then define what the cabinet is. And that is something that council could provide oversight on and ordain. And that could vary somewhat from administration to administration to give each new mayor a little latitude of what that might include. But it would also give council a certain amount of oversight and purview into who we're talking about could step into that role. So if this topic is something that this commission is willing to entertain, I think the next step would be for the administration to work with the city attorney to come back to this body with some draft language for you to consider and continue the conversation from that point. Perhaps even present options. And we can provide those in advance of a future meeting, and so that you can have the opportunity to make suggestion and, frankly, to Commissioner Watson's point of view, not belabor the point too long, but get to a point of action. We'll do whatever the pleasure of the commission is.
Quick question, Chair. Just a quick follow-up. Speaking of belaboring points, just to clarify my earlier question and your response about the different sections of the charter for acting mayor and temporary inability. So did I hear you correctly that if the mayor were to be incapacitated, the language there is fine? What we're really talking about here is if, and the changes we're considering would be if the mayor were going to be out of town or, whatever the circumstances are, how that appointment works and providing some more guidance in the charter about that scenario, not necessarily the incapacitated component. Is that correct?
From the administration's point of view, yes.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I have a question as it relates to, because I'm still trying to understand circumstances into which the mayor would be briefly incapacitated or not physically present to, sign documents, whatever it may be, or execute, various, duties and responsibilities that he or she may have. But you, as chief of staff, have the ability to sign documents and things of that nature. And you said there was someone else also that has the power to do that as well. I'm trying to figure out, if that's the case, what circumstances would there be necessary for he or she, the mayor, to actually appoint someone to sign documents if you can already do that or execute certain things on their behalf?
Sure. On a day-to-day basis, I and another deputy chief of staff essentially have been afforded by the mayor the signature authority to enter into contract. Where that becomes more complicated is in the case of legislation where this is where I wish I had gone to law school, Laura, where I don't fully understand, but the city attorney might explain, but the power to enact legislation and that signatory authority is afforded the mayor solely. Now, interestingly, legislation can go into effect absent the mayor's signature, and it sometimes occurs, but it's usually on a one-off basis. Sometimes that power is reserved to send a message that perhaps maybe the mayor doesn't support the legislation that's been passed by council, but nevertheless does not want to veto that legislation. So legislation, if it were passed by council, would go in effect 10 days after it's submitted to the mayor. And so, in theory, most work of council and the city could continue indefinitely. That said, for the good government, sort of the foundations of our democracy, there might be circumstances where that wouldn't really be acceptable to the general public, and we wouldn't want to see carried forward. And I can give some examples. So if the mayor visits friends in Indianapolis over the course of a weekend, only a couple hours away, that may or may not be a reason to name an acting mayor. Certainly is something where she or he could predict that trip and name an acting mayor. Our mayor, not to get too deep into his personal business, but has a bad knee. Should he ever need to have a knee replacement, that would be surgery, where he would be under general anesthesia for a certain period of time. Certainly predictable in an instance where you could appoint an acting mayor. That is different, though, than if she or he would suffer some sort of traumatic injury that would incapacitate them for some period of time. That would be unknown. In which case, that question of when someone becomes incapacitated beyond a predictable period of time, and when the separate section of the charter may come into play. In which case, and to Commissioner McCarthy's point, we wouldn't necessarily want to address that code because I think there may be an appropriate point in time where the council president may assume the powers of mayor. And under that section of the charter would leave behind the powers of a member of council and become the mayor. No one likes to talk about those circumstances because you hope they never occur. The good news is that the last Charter Review Commission before you took on that issue, because for more than 200 years that issue was left silent. It was not addressed in our charter, but it is now, and that's an example of how the work that you're doing now is important for future councils, future mayors, the future of our city. Hopefully, I sort of sketched out the different circumstances where those issues might come up. The city attorney may want to weigh in and add on.
And I'll just piggyback off of that. So an individual who has signature authority for an official, that is limited to being signature authority. There might be actions that a mayor wants to take where if that mayor is not available to do so, not in the city, the acting mayor would actually be able to take those actions in the mayor's place. Just a quick, off the top of my head, question. Let's say that there was a question as to whether or not we should close a particular building early on a given day because maybe, I don't know, there was some damage from flooding, something, not very serious, but something where a decision has to be made, and that decision would normally, assuming that decision would normally fall to the mayor, the acting mayor would have the authority to make that decision through the power of being acting mayor. So it's not just that they can sign on a mayor's behalf, but they can actually make that call.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments on this matter? John, I do have a question. As it relates to moving forward with this particular topic, do we need a motion as a body to move forward with this discussion as it relates to recommendations being provided to the commissioners, or does it just happen? Do we need a motion for that or not?
Typically that's up to the commissioners. I don't think it would be necessary in this situation. We would just probably bring it up as old business, probably in the next one. And should additional materials come in, we can present those at that time, and then perhaps even make a motion if that's what we would understand the commissioner's intent to be. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. And I'm sorry, I didn't write this down at the last meeting. What is our time frame on this? You're going to have a public meeting in May, and then the next, what happens? next? I don't recall, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. So on the schedule of the commission, right now, we have the set meetings that have been scheduled so far out
Right.
through to the end of June, at which time we would have probably a final meeting after that to finalize any recommendations, make sure that you've all the commissioners have made a decision about what recommendations they want to make and want to be included in a report to council and the mayor, and have those submitted. The charter dictates 6 months after your appointment, so that'd be July 10th. I believe it was Chair Bartley's intent to try to have that in July 8th, as the 10th is a Sunday, so during the work week at any rate. After which we had talked about having an additional public hearing. This one would probably involve council as well in second or third week of July, probably the second week of July, if we can do it, for public input as to what action that the public would feel that council should take on the recommendations. So from here, for after May, we would have 3 more right now that we have scheduled regular meetings following that hearing, and then a meeting to discuss finalizing the report. It would be due, and then we would have a hearing mid-July, and after which the last regular opportunity council would have to approve any ordinances should they take up the commission, any or all the commission's recommendations, to ordain them to place on the ballot for November. That would come at the final scheduled meeting, July 25th.
Thank you.
Certainly.
I just want us to be mindful of the time frame that we're working under, the timeline that we're working under. I just want us to always be on point. I want us to always include the public for comments. I just want us to be mindful of the time frame that we're working with. Thank you.
Thank you for that, John and Commissioner. My last request would be, Mr. Paul, could you submit recommendations to the commission as it relates to this matter?
I look forward to the opportunity, and we will get that to you in the very near future.
Thank you. Any other comments as it relates to this item? All right, moving on to the administrative items. John?
Sure. Nothing much on this front this week. We have most of our meetings scheduled out. If you hadn't heard from Stephanie Shoemaker, you should be soon. I know that Chair Bartley out of town, she may have been staffing her for some of that, but to get a May public hearing on the calendar, and just with a couple of the commissioners had mentioned some difficulty accessing the share drive for our materials. I'm following up with DOT on that just to make sure nothing's broken on our end, but if it is, we can get that fixed and make sure everybody's having access to that all the time, because we're always uploading the materials there a few days prior to the meeting when we have them. So appreciate it.
And John, when is our next meeting?
Next meeting will be 2 weeks from today, same time. May perhaps try to move over to room 225 if it's available during that time, but otherwise still right here. It'll be April the 20th, Wednesday at 3.
Yes, sir. And have all of the commissioners accepted that? I believe so. We did all accept that date as, okay.
Yes.
All right. Is there anything else for the good of the order? No? All right. Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Need a second?
Second.
Thank you. Moved and seconded. This meeting is adjourned.